The box was wrapped lovingly in blue ribbon. Inside lay a medal reserved for high-value KGB assets. The engraving matched a code name he'd been hunting for years, and the agent he sought had been sleeping beside him. Washington, D.C., March 17, 1978. A Friday evening that began with cake and champagne would end with a man sitting alone in his kitchen, staring at a piece of metal that proved his entire adult life had been a performance staged by Moscow Center. The medal was small, brass, unremarkable to anyone unfamiliar with Soviet honors. But Thomas Crane knew exactly what it was. He had seen photographs of identical decorations in classified briefings. He had written reports about the people who received them. He had spent 11 years tracking the network that distributed them to illegals operating in the continental United States. The box had arrived by regular mail that morning, addressed to his wife, Margaret, in handwriting he did not recognize. She had opened it at breakfast, glanced inside, then closed it quickly. Too quickly. When he asked what it was, she smiled and said it was a joke gift from her sister in Philadelphia. Something about an old family story, nothing important. He believed her because belief was easier than the alternative. Because they had been married for 16 years. Because she made him coffee every morning exactly the way he liked it, and remembered to buy the specific brand of aftershave he preferred, and had sat beside him through his father's funeral without complaint. Because the idea that she might be anything other than Margaret Crane, former librarian, current part-time bookkeeper, mother of their 2 daughters, was absurd. But that evening, while she was upstairs helping their youngest with homework, Thomas opened the box again. The medal bore an inscription in Cyrillic. He did not read Russian fluently, but he knew enough. Order of the Red Banner, reserved for exceptional service to the Soviet state, and beneath that, engraved in smaller letters, a code name that made his hands go cold. Sparrow. He had been hunting Sparrow since 1967. Before we go further into what Thomas found that night, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Which city and country? And if you're finding this story as unsettling as it should be, hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already and turn on notifications, because what happened next changed everything the agency thought it knew about Soviet penetration in America. The Cold War was not fought with armies clashing on open battlefields. It was fought in offices and living rooms, and the small spaces where trust resides. By March of 1978, the intelligence community had spent 3 decades trying to identify and neutralize Soviet intelligence networks operating inside the United States. The effort consumed billions of dollars and thousands of careers. It produced successes and catastrophic failures in roughly equal measure. The Venona Project, begun in 1943 and declassified only decades later, had proven that Soviet intelligence services had successfully penetrated the Manhattan Project, the State Department, and multiple defense contractors. The decryption of Soviet cables revealed codenames but rarely identities. Entire investigations collapsed because a single agent could not be definitively connected to a single name. The paranoia this created was justified. If Julius and Ethel Rosenberg could pass atomic secrets to Moscow, if Kim Philby could rise to the upper echelons of British intelligence while reporting to the KGB, if Aldrich Ames could betray entire networks of American assets, then anyone could be anyone. Trust became a luxury the intelligence community could not afford. By the late 70s, the CIA's counterintelligence division operated under the assumption that every major American institution had been penetrated to some degree. Banks, universities, technology firms, government agencies, even local police departments. The Soviets did not need to plant hundreds of agents. They needed to plant the right agents in the right places and wait. Thomas Crane worked in signals analysis, a branch of intelligence work that dealt primarily with intercepted communications. He was not a field operative. He did not carry a weapon or conduct surveillance or recruit assets in foreign capitals. He sat in a windowless office in Langley and studied transcripts of conversations recorded by equipment he would never see, in countries he would never visit. His job was to find patterns, a repeated phrase, an unusual routing of a phone call, a gap in transmission that suggested someone had stopped talking because they knew they were being monitored. It was tedious work that required patience and intolerance for ambiguity. Most of what he analyzed led nowhere. But occasionally, a pattern would emerge that suggested something operational, a network activating, a courier moving, an asset being contacted. In 1967, Thomas had been assigned to a task force investigating a series of compromised operations in Western Europe. Someone was leaking information about American intelligence activities to the Soviets. The leaks were selective and sophisticated. They did not expose entire networks, which would have been obvious. Instead, they exposed just enough to render specific operations ineffective. A planned surveillance would find its target already gone. A recruiting pitch would be declined by someone who should not have known they were being recruited. A technical installation would be discovered and dismantled before it could produce useful intelligence. The task force designated the source of these leaks with the codename Sparrow. The name was arbitrary, selected from a randomized list of bird species. But over the years it acquired a weight that arbitrary designations sometimes do. Sparrow became more than a codename. It became a problem that would not resolve. The task force identified 43 possible candidates. They eliminated 38. The remaining 5 were monitored for 2 years without producing actionable evidence. The investigation stalled. Resources were redirected. Thomas continued working the file in whatever spare time he could justify, but by 1975 the official position was that Sparrow had either gone dormant or never existed as a single individual. Perhaps the compromises were coincidental. Perhaps they were the result of poor operational security rather than deliberate betrayal. Thomas did not believe that. He had studied the pattern too carefully. Someone was out there, still active, still reporting. Margaret Crane had been born Margaret Hollis in 1938 in Camden, New Jersey, to a machinist and a seamstress. She attended public schools and graduated with unremarkable grades. She worked for 2 years as a clerk in a department store, then enrolled in a library science program at a local college. She completed the program in 1960 and took a position at the Georgetown Public Library in Washington. She met Thomas at a civic function in 1961. He was 26, recently hired by a government agency he could not name. She was 23 and thought he seemed serious but kind. They dated for 7 months. He proposed in the reading room of the library where she worked, which she found appropriate. They married in June of 1962. Their first daughter was born in 1964, their second in 1967. Margaret stopped working full-time after the first child and took occasional bookkeeping jobs to supplement Thomas's salary. She volunteered at the girls' school. She organized neighborhood potlucks. She maintained a small garden in their backyard and grew tomatoes that never quite ripened properly because the soil was too acidic. She was, by every measure Thomas could identify, exactly who she appeared to be. The file he would later request from archives told a similar story. Margaret Hollis, background check completed in 1962 as part of his security clearance process. No flags, no foreign contacts. No inconsistencies. The file was thin because there was nothing in it worth noting. The medal arrived on a Friday because someone wanted it to arrive on a Friday. Someone who knew that Thomas would be home that evening. Someone who knew that Margaret would open it in his presence. Someone who wanted Thomas to see her reaction, even if he did not understand it immediately. The package had been mailed from Philadelphia, postmarked March 14th. No return address. The handwriting on the label was careful and anonymous, the kind produced by someone who has practiced writing in a way that reveals nothing. Inside the package was only the box, wrapped in blue ribbon, and inside the box was only the medal. No note, no explanation. Just the object itself and the message it carried for anyone trained to read it. Thomas did not confront Margaret that evening. He replaced the medal in the box and put the box back where he had found it, on the shelf in the hallway closet, where Margaret kept gift wrap and greeting cards. He went upstairs and kissed his daughters good night. He returned downstairs and sat with Margaret while they watched television, some comedy program he could not focus on. She laughed at the appropriate moments. She rested her hand on his knee the way she always did. When the program ended, they went to bed. He lay awake in the dark and listened to her breathing and thought about the medal and what it meant and what he was going to do about it. Sparrow had always been careful. The compromises attributed to the source were spaced months apart, sometimes years. They affected operations in different regions with different objectives. There was no obvious pattern except the fact that each compromise suggested access to compartmented information. Someone with clearance, someone with need to know. Someone who understood operational security well enough to avoid leaving traces. In 1969, an operation targeting a suspected KGB officer in Brussels was aborted after the target failed to appear at a scheduled meeting. Subsequent investigation revealed that the target had left Belgium 3 days earlier, though there was no indication he knew he was under surveillance. In 1971, a technical installation in a Soviet trade office in Vienna was discovered and dismantled before it could be activated. The installation had required months of planning and significant resources. Only 7 people knew the full details. All 7 were investigated. Nothing conclusive emerged. In 1973, a recruitment pitch to a Soviet diplomat in Stockholm was declined with a degree of foreknowledge that suggested the diplomat had been briefed. The diplomat was recalled to Moscow shortly afterward, which usually indicated that Moscow suspected he was being targeted. But the operation had been planned with extreme discretion. The pitch was supposed to be deniable, casual, low risk. Someone had told Moscow it was coming. Thomas had reviewed these cases so many times he could recite the operational details from memory. He had built timelines and diagrams. He had compared personnel lists and travel records. He had requested communications logs and financial audits. He had found nothing that definitively connected any individual to the compromises. But he had found something else. A negative space, an absence. There were people who had access to all 3 operations. People who could have known the details. But when Thomas cross-referenced their movements and communications, he found gaps, small inconsistencies. Moments when someone was not quite where they were supposed to be, or said something that did not quite align with what they should have known. It was not evidence. It was the shape of evidence missing. Margaret had grown up during the Depression and remembered it with the kind of clarity that people who experienced deprivation, young, always do. She told stories about her father working double shifts at the machine shop and still struggling to pay rent. About her mother sewing clothes for neighbors to earn extra money. About eating the same meal 3 days in a row because that was what they could afford. She was 12 when the war ended, and 14 when the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb. She was in high school when Senator McCarthy began his investigations, and in college when the Rosenbergs were executed. She was part of a generation that had been taught to see communism not as a political ideology, but as an existential threat. She had participated in civil defense drills. She had watched films about what to do in case of nuclear attack. She had lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis and understood, as everyone who lived through it understood, that the world had come within hours of ending. This was the woman Thomas knew. The woman who worried about fallout shelters and kept a radio tuned to emergency broadcast frequencies and made sure their daughters understood that the Soviets were not simply adversaries but enemies of everything America represented. It was difficult to reconcile that woman with the possibility that she had been working for Moscow Center since before they met. Thomas did not sleep that night. At some point near dawn, he got out of bed and went downstairs and made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table and watched the sky lighten through the window. He thought about what he was going to do and realized he had no idea. If he reported what he had found, the agency would investigate. Margaret would be interrogated. Their daughters would be questioned. Their home would be searched. Their finances would be audited. Every friend, every neighbor, every casual acquaintance would be interviewed. The life they had built would be dismantled piece by piece until nothing remained except the truth, whatever that was. And if the truth was what the medal suggested, then Margaret would be arrested and prosecuted and imprisoned, and Thomas would be left to explain to their daughters why their mother was a traitor. But if he did nothing, if he pretended he had never seen the medal, then he was complicit. He was allowing an active Soviet agent to continue operating. He was betraying his oath and his country and every principle he claimed to believe in. There was no option that did not destroy something. Margaret came downstairs at 7, the same time she always did. She started breakfast. She asked Thomas if he wanted eggs. He said yes. She cooked them the way he liked, scrambled with a little milk to make them softer. She poured him more coffee. She asked if he had slept well. He said he had. She mentioned that their oldest daughter had a piano recital the following week, and they needed to remember to attend. He said he would put it on his calendar. They ate breakfast together at the table, the same way they had eaten breakfast together for 16 years. The medal was still in the closet upstairs. Neither of them mentioned it. Thomas arrived at Langley at 8:30 and went directly to his office. He did not speak to anyone. He closed the door and sat at his desk and stared at the files stacked in front of him without seeing them. He had built his career on analysis, on the patient accumulation of evidence until a pattern emerged that could not be denied. But now he was inside the pattern. He was the evidence. His marriage was the operational cover. His home was the safe house. His life was the lie. He needed to think clearly, but clarity required distance, and distance was impossible when the problem was sleeping in your bed. At 9:15, his phone rang. It was Margaret. She never called him at work unless it was important. He answered, and she said she was sorry to bother him, but she had forgotten to mention that her sister was coming to visit next week, and she wanted to make sure he would be home for dinner on Tuesday. He said he would try. She thanked him and hung up. The call lasted 37 seconds. It was perfectly ordinary, except for the fact that Margaret did not have a sister. She was an only child. Thomas had met her parents before they died. He had seen her birth certificate when they applied for their marriage license. There was no sister in Philadelphia or anywhere else. The package had been mailed from Philadelphia. Margaret had said the medal was a gift from her sister in Philadelphia. She had constructed a cover story that morning at breakfast and then reinforced it with a phone call to his office, knowing that office calls were logged and could be reviewed. She was establishing a narrative. She was creating documentation that would support her explanation if anyone ever questioned it. She was doing exactly what a trained intelligence officer would do. Thomas hung up the phone and sat very still. The woman he had married was not who he thought she was. But he had known that since last night. What he was realizing now was that she knew he knew. The phone call was not about dinner plans. It was a message. I am aware that you found the medal. I am aware that you understand what it means. I am giving you the opportunity to accept my cover story and move forward as if nothing has changed. Or you can destroy both of us. The choice is yours. Thomas had spent 11 years hunting Sparrow, and now Sparrow was giving him a way out. It was almost funny, except that nothing about this was funny. He locked his office door and retrieved a folder from his filing cabinet. The folder contained his personal notes on the Sparrow investigation, information he had never included in official reports because it was speculative and unsupported. Theories, hunches, the kind of material that could ruin a career if it turned out to be wrong. He had been building a profile of Sparrow based not on evidence but on methodology. How the source operated, what the compromises revealed about the source's psychology. Sparrow never took unnecessary risks. Sparrow never exposed information that was not operationally valuable. Sparrow never acted out of ideology or emotion. Every compromise served a specific purpose, and that purpose was always strategic rather than tactical. This suggested someone with training, someone who understood intelligence work at a level that required years of experience, someone who had been inserted into position long before they were activated. The KGB's illegals program had been operating since the 1920s. An illegal was an intelligence officer who entered a target country under false identity and lived there for years, sometimes decades, establishing a cover life that appeared completely ordinary. They did not work at embassies or trade missions. They did not have diplomatic immunity. If they were caught, Moscow would deny any knowledge of them. They were expendable, but invaluable. An illegal could do things that a legal officer could never do. They could access spaces that were off-limits to known Soviet citizens. They could develop relationships that would be impossible for someone under diplomatic cover. They could wait. The waiting was the important part. An illegal might be inserted into a target country at age 25 and not be activated until age 40. 15 years of living an ordinary life, building a career, getting married, having children, becoming part of the community. 15 years of being exactly what they appeared to be. And then one day, a signal would come, and they would begin doing what they had been sent to do. The investment was enormous, but so was the payoff. By the time an illegal was activated, they had become invisible. They had no suspicious connections, no unexplained absences, no financial irregularities. They were simply a person living a normal life who happened to be committing espionage. Margaret had arrived in Washington in 1960 and married a CIA analyst in 1962. She had done nothing suspicious for 5 years. The first compromise attributed to Sparrow occurred in 1967, the same year their second daughter was born. If Margaret was Sparrow, and Thomas was now certain she was, then she had been activated sometime between 1966 and 1967, which meant she had spent 7 years building her cover before beginning her actual work. 7 years of marriage and motherhood and library volunteering and neighborhood potlucks. 7 years of being Margaret Crane so thoroughly that even her husband, a man trained to identify deception, had never suspected her. Thomas felt something that might have been admiration if it had not also been horror. She had been better at her job than he had been at his. The protocol for handling a suspected illegal was clearly defined. Report immediately to counterintelligence. Do not confront the suspect. Do not alter your behavior in any way that might alert the suspect. Allow the professionals to handle the investigation. Thomas knew the protocol because he had written parts of it. He had contributed to the guidelines that governed exactly this situation. And now he was sitting in his office thinking about how to avoid following those guidelines because following them meant destroying his family. He thought about his daughters. Sarah was 14, Jennifer was 11. They did not know what their father did for work, except that it was something for the government. They did not know what their mother had done before they were born, except that she had worked in a library. They lived ordinary lives in an ordinary suburb and went to ordinary schools and had ordinary friends. If Margaret was arrested, that would end. The girls would become the children of a Soviet spy. They would be questioned by investigators who would want to know if they had ever noticed anything unusual about their mother. If she had ever received strange visitors or made suspicious phone calls or traveled anywhere without explanation. The girls would say no because there had been nothing to notice. Margaret had been careful, but the questions themselves would plant doubt. The girls would start remembering things differently. They would start wondering if moments they thought were normal had actually been something else. They would lose their mother and their sense of reality at the same time. Thomas had seen what happened to the families of exposed intelligence officers. The marriages that ended. The children who stopped speaking to their parents. The ordinary lives that collapsed under the weight of betrayal. He could prevent that. All he had to do was nothing. At 11 o'clock, Thomas left his office and walked down to the cafeteria. He bought coffee he did not want and sat at a table near the window. He needed to be around people, even if he could not talk to them. He needed to remember that the world still existed outside the problem consuming him. A colleague from signals analysis sat down across from him. Her name was Patricia Donnelly, and they had worked together for 6 years. She asked him if he was all right because apparently he looked terrible. He said he had not slept well. She said she understood. Her youngest had been sick all week, and she felt like she had not slept in a month. They talked about children and illnesses and the various failures of modern medicine for 10 minutes. It was a completely ordinary conversation. When it was over, Patricia went back to work, and Thomas stayed at the table. He thought about what it would mean to have this conversation with Patricia if she knew what he knew. If she knew that he had discovered his wife was a Soviet illegal and had not reported it. She would look at him differently. Everyone would look at him differently. He would no longer be Thomas Crane, reliable analyst, devoted husband. He would be Thomas Crane, security risk, possible accomplice. Because the question would be asked, how could you live with someone for 16 years and not know? How could you share a bed and raise children and build a life with a Soviet intelligence officer and remain completely unaware? Either you were catastrophically incompetent, or you were complicit. There was no third option that did not strain credulity. Thomas returned to his office and spent the afternoon pretending to work. He reviewed signals transcripts without absorbing their content. He drafted a report that said nothing of value. He attended a meeting where people discussed things that seemed important until he thought about what was happening in his house. At 5 o'clock, he went home. Margaret was in the kitchen preparing dinner. The girls were upstairs doing homework. Everything was exactly as it should be. Thomas stood in the doorway and watched his wife dice vegetables with practiced efficiency. She did not look like a spy. She looked like someone who had been making dinner for her family for 16 years and knew exactly how long each component needed to cook. She glanced up and saw him and smiled. She asked him how his day was. He said it was fine. She said dinner would be ready in 20 minutes. He said that was fine too. He went upstairs and changed out of his work clothes and came back down and set the table. They ate together as a family. Sarah talked about a test she had taken. Jennifer complained about a girl in her class who was being mean. Margaret asked appropriate questions and offered appropriate advice. Thomas contributed when expected. After dinner, he helped with dishes while Margaret checked the girls' homework. At 9 o'clock they went to bed. Margaret fell asleep within minutes. Thomas lay awake and listened to her breathe and wondered how many reports she had filed about him. What details of his work had she passed to Moscow? What operations had been compromised because he had mentioned them casually over breakfast or dinner, thinking he was talking to his wife when he was actually briefing a hostile intelligence service? Tell us in the comments what time you're watching this. And if this story is making you question everything you thought you knew about trust, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because what happened next revealed just how deep the deception went. The weekend passed. Thomas and Margaret took the girls to a movie on Saturday afternoon. They went to church on Sunday morning, something they did irregularly, but often enough that it seemed normal. They had lunch with neighbors. They raked leaves in the yard. They existed in the performance of an ordinary suburban family, and Thomas could not tell any more where the performance ended and reality began. On Monday morning, he went back to work. On Monday evening, he came home. On Tuesday morning, Margaret's supposed sister was supposed to visit. Thomas called in sick. He told his supervisor he had caught whatever his colleague Patricia's daughter had been suffering from. The supervisor told him to rest and feel better. Thomas hung up and stayed home. Margaret did not seem surprised. She made him tea and suggested he go back to bed. He said he would rather sit on the couch. She brought him a blanket and turned on the television to a news program. She went upstairs to do laundry. Thomas waited until he heard the washing machine start, then went to the hallway closet and retrieved the box with the medal. He brought it back to the living room and opened it and looked at the medal again in daylight. The inscription was clear. Order of the Red Banner. Sparrow. He had been right. He was always right when he trusted his analysis. The problem was he had never analyzed his own life. At 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Thomas answered it because Margaret was still upstairs. A woman stood on the porch, perhaps 60 years old, well-dressed, carrying a handbag. She looked like someone's aunt. She looked at Thomas and said she was here to see Margaret. Thomas asked who she was. The woman said her name was Helen and Margaret was expecting her. Thomas let her in because refusing would have required an explanation he was not prepared to give. He called upstairs for Margaret. Margaret came down and saw the woman, and her expression did not change, but something in her posture did. She thanked Thomas for answering the door and suggested he should rest since he was not feeling well. Thomas went back to the living room. Margaret and the woman went into the kitchen and closed the door. Thomas sat on the couch with the television on and listened to the low murmur of voices from the other room. He could not make out words, but he could hear tone. The conversation was businesslike. Margaret was receiving instructions. The woman who called herself Helen was a handler, someone from the Soviet embassy, or a cutout with no direct connection to the embassy. The medal had not been a gift. It had been a message. Something had changed. Something required Margaret to be contacted directly, which was a violation of standard operational security and indicated urgency. Thomas thought about going into the kitchen and confronting both of them, demanding answers, forcing the situation into the open. But he did nothing. He sat on the couch and watched television and waited. The woman left after 45 minutes. Margaret saw her to the door and returned to the living room. She sat down beside Thomas and asked him if he wanted more tea. He said no. She picked up a magazine from the coffee table and began paging through it. Thomas looked at her and said, "Who was that?" Margaret said it was her friend Helen from the library auxiliary. They were planning a book sale. Thomas said he thought her sister was visiting today. Margaret looked at him and said her sister had called yesterday and cancelled. Had he forgotten? She had mentioned it at dinner. Thomas had no memory of this because it had not happened. But he could not prove it had not happened. That was how cover stories worked. They were constructed from material that could not be definitively contradicted. He said he must have forgotten. Margaret smiled and said it was fine. He was sick. People forget things when they are sick. She went back to her magazine. Thomas went back to the television. They sat together for the rest of the morning in a silence that felt like negotiation. By Wednesday, Thomas had made a decision. He could not report Margaret because reporting her would destroy his family. But he could not do nothing, because doing nothing made him complicit in her activities. The only option left was to control the information she had access to. He began changing his routines. He stopped bringing work home. He stopped discussing cases with her, even in the vague terms he had previously used. When she asked about his day, he gave answers that were true but meaningless. He mentioned meetings that had occurred but not what was discussed. He mentioned reports he had written but not what they contained. He became careful in a way he had never been careful before because he had never needed to be. Margaret noticed. Of course she noticed. But she did not say anything. She adapted. She stopped asking questions that were too specific. She stopped showing interest in topics that were too operational. She became more careful too. They were both professionals now, operating in the same space, using the same techniques, trying not to acknowledge what they both knew. The marriage became a kind of operational theater where two intelligence officers pretended to be a normal couple while quietly managing each other as security risks. Thomas continued working the Sparrow investigation, but he stopped looking for Sparrow. He knew where Sparrow was. Instead, he started looking for evidence of what Sparrow had accomplished. He reviewed every compromised operation from the past 11 years and tried to determine what information would have been required to compromise it. Then he reviewed his own life and tried to remember if he had ever possessed that information and if he had ever discussed it at home. The results were inconclusive. Some operations he had known about, others he had not. Which meant either Margaret had other sources or Thomas had forgotten conversations that had occurred years ago in contexts that seemed too ordinary to remember. A comment made while watching television. A question asked while driving to the grocery store. An observation offered during a walk through the neighborhood. Intelligence work is not about stealing complete files. It is about collecting fragments over time and assembling them into understanding. Margaret had been collecting fragments from him for 11 years. He had no way of knowing what she had assembled. In April, Thomas received notification that he was being transferred to a different division. The transfer was presented as a promotion, but it was actually a lateral move to a position with less access to sensitive material. No explanation was given. Thomas understood. Someone in counterintelligence had noticed something, a pattern, an inconsistency. They had not yet connected it to Margaret, but they had connected it to him. He was being moved to a less critical position while they investigated. The transfer was scheduled for May 1st. Thomas accepted it without protest, because protesting would have drawn more attention. He went home that evening and told Margaret about the transfer. She said congratulations. She said it sounded like a good opportunity. She asked if it would mean longer hours or more travel. He said he did not think so. She said that was good. The girls would be happy to have him home for dinner. They discussed the transfer the way people discuss changes in employment, as if it were normal, as if it meant what it appeared to mean. Neither of them acknowledged what it actually meant, which was that Thomas's career was ending because someone suspected him of being exactly what he was, which was compromised. The agency did not arrest people dramatically. It isolated them. It moved them to positions where they could do less damage. It monitored them until it had enough evidence to justify prosecution, or enough doubt to justify dismissal. Thomas had participated in this process himself. He had reviewed the cases of suspected security risks and recommended actions that would protect classified information while the investigation continued. Now he was the case being reviewed. His phone was probably being monitored. His office was probably being searched when he was not there. His financial records were being audited. His travel history was being analyzed. His contacts were being mapped. Eventually, someone would interview Margaret. They would ask her routine questions about her background and her activities, and whether she had noticed anything unusual about her husband's behavior. She would answer with exactly the right balance of concern and cooperation. She would express surprise that anyone would suspect Thomas of anything. She would provide details that supported his innocence while carefully avoiding anything that might complicate the investigation. She would be perfect, because being perfect was what she did. Thomas spent May and June in his new position, which involved reviewing historical intelligence assessments for lessons learned. It was work that required no clearance and produced no operational value. It was the kind of assignment given to people who were being eased into retirement or eased out of the organization entirely. He did the work competently because he did everything competently. In July, he was called into a meeting with 2 officers from counterintelligence. They asked him questions about his work history, about specific operations, about how information was compartmented and who had access to what. They did not accuse him of anything. They were just gathering information. Thomas answered every question honestly because lying would have been pointless. He had not stolen documents or passed classified information to anyone. His only crime was knowing that his wife was a Soviet illegal and not reporting it. But they could not prove he knew, unless they could prove Margaret was an illegal. And they could not prove Margaret was an illegal unless they caught her doing something that illegals do, which she was too careful to do. The investigation continued through August and September. Thomas was interviewed 3 more times. Margaret was interviewed once, in their home, with Thomas present. She was gracious and helpful. She offered coffee. She answered questions about their marriage and their family and whether Thomas had ever exhibited any unusual behavior. She said no. Thomas was exactly what he appeared to be, a dedicated civil servant who took his work seriously. The investigators thanked her for her time and left. That evening, Margaret made dinner, and they ate with the girls, and no one mentioned that anything unusual had occurred. In October, Thomas received a letter informing him that he was being placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. The letter was formal and bureaucratic. It did not specify what was being investigated or what he was suspected of. It simply stated that he should not report to work until further notice. His salary would continue. His benefits would continue. He should make himself available for additional interviews if requested. Thomas read the letter twice and put it in a drawer. He told Margaret that evening. She said it must be a misunderstanding. She said these things happen in government sometimes. Bureaucratic errors. Someone misfiled something or confused him with someone else. She said it would be resolved soon. Thomas said he hoped so. They did not discuss it further. Administrative leave lasted through November and December. Thomas stayed home. He drove the girls to school. He helped with homework. He did yard work. He became the kind of father who is always present because he has nowhere else to be. Margaret continued her bookkeeping work. She continued volunteering at the school. She continued organizing neighborhood events. She was busy in a way that made it clear she was not concerned about the investigation, because people who are concerned do not maintain normal routines so perfectly. At Christmas, they had dinner with neighbors and gave the girls presents and attended church services. Everything was fine except that Thomas had not worked in 2 months and probably would never work again. In January of 1979, Thomas received a second letter informing him that the investigation had been completed and no evidence of security violations had been found. However, due to administrative restructuring, his position had been eliminated. He was being offered early retirement with full benefits. The offer was presented as generous. It was actually an ultimatum. Accept retirement or be fired without benefits. Thomas accepted retirement. He was 44 years old. His career was over. He had spent 18 years in signals analysis and accomplished nothing except marrying a Soviet spy and failing to report it. Margaret said she was sorry about the retirement, but perhaps it was for the best. He had been working too hard for too long. Now he would have time to relax, time to spend with the family, time to do things he enjoyed. Thomas said yes, perhaps it was for the best. He did not mention that he no longer knew what he enjoyed, or if he had ever enjoyed anything, or if his entire adult life had been something other than what he thought it was. Retirement was not what people imagine. It was not leisure. It was administrative dissolution. Thomas received his final paycheck in February. He received paperwork about his pension. He received a letter thanking him for his service. He received nothing else, no explanation, no closure. No acknowledgement that he had spent nearly 2 decades trying to protect his country from exactly the kind of threat he had been living with in his own home. He had been removed from the system because the system could not determine whether he was compromised or merely unlucky. The distinction did not matter. Either way, he was a risk. Margaret continued her routines. The girls continued school. Life continued as if nothing had changed except that Thomas no longer left the house each morning and returned each evening. He was simply there, all the time, present and purposeless. In March, on their 17th wedding anniversary, Margaret gave him a watch. It was a nice watch, expensive, the kind of gift that suggested thought and care. She said she hoped he would think of her when he looked at it. Thomas thanked her and put it on and thought about the medal that had arrived exactly 1 year earlier. The medal that had ended his career and revealed his life as fiction. He wondered if the watch had meaning beyond being a watch, if it was a message or a symbol or simply what it appeared to be. He would never know because asking would require acknowledging what could not be acknowledged. They had dinner that evening at a restaurant. They talked about the girls and the neighbors and plans for summer vacation. They did not talk about the past year or what it had cost them. They did not talk about Sparrow or Moscow Center or the investigation that had quietly destroyed Thomas's career. They talked about nothing important and went home and went to bed. Margaret continued her work for another 6 years. Thomas knew this because operations continued to be compromised in ways that suggested Sparrow was still active. He no longer had access to classified reporting, but he read newspapers. He noticed when diplomatic initiatives failed unexpectedly, when negotiations collapsed for reasons that were never quite explained, when technology transfers were blocked by foreign governments who should not have known they were being attempted. The pattern continued. Sparrow continued. Thomas said nothing because there was nothing to say. In 1985, Margaret suggested they take a trip to Europe. She had always wanted to see Paris and London and Rome. Thomas agreed because refusing would have required explanation. They spent 3 weeks traveling through Western Europe. Margaret took photographs and bought souvenirs and seemed genuinely delighted by the museums and cathedrals they visited. In Paris, she bought a scarf from a street vendor. In London, she bought tea from Harrods. In Rome, she bought a small statue of St. Peter. They were tourists. They were also, Thomas realized halfway through the trip, executing a prearranged signal. The trip itself was the message. Margaret was being extracted. Moscow Center had decided her operational life was ending, and she was being brought home. Except she was not going home because she was already home. Her home was with Thomas and their daughters. Her home was the life she had built over 23 years. Moscow Center could not extract her without revealing her, and revealing her served no purpose if she was no longer operationally valuable. They returned to the United States in June. Margaret resumed her bookkeeping work. Thomas resumed his purposeless retirement. In November, the Berlin Wall fell. Thomas watched it on television and felt nothing. The Cold War was ending and everyone was celebrating as if endings were victories. But Thomas knew that endings were just different kinds of losses. The wall coming down did not change what had happened. It did not restore his career or explain his life or answer any of the questions he had stopped asking. Margaret watched the coverage with him. She said it was wonderful, all those people celebrating freedom. Thomas said yes, it was wonderful. He did not ask her what she thought about the dissolution of the system she had served. He did not ask if she felt relief or regret, or anything at all. They watched the wall fall together and then turned off the television and went to bed. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Margaret was 53 years old. Thomas was 56. Their daughters were grown. Sarah worked for a publishing company in New York. Jennifer was finishing graduate school in California. The house was empty except for Thomas and Margaret, and the decades of secrets between them. They never discussed it. Not once in all the years that followed. Thomas never asked Margaret if she had been Sparrow. Margaret never confirmed or denied it. They lived together as husband and wife for another 14 years until Margaret died of cancer in 2005. She was 67. Thomas was 70. At her funeral, their daughters spoke about what a wonderful mother she had been. How devoted to her family, how kind to her neighbors, how involved in her community. Everything they said was true. Margaret had been all of those things. She had also been a Soviet intelligence officer who had spent 23 years stealing secrets from the country where she lived. Both things were true simultaneously. Thomas stood at her grave and thought about the medal. He had kept it, hidden in his study in a locked drawer. He had never shown it to anyone. After the funeral, he went home and took it out and looked at it one final time. Order of the Red Banner. Sparrow. He put it back in the drawer and locked it, and never opened it again. Thomas Crane died in 2011 at the age of 76. His daughters arranged his funeral and sorted through his possessions and found the medal in his study. They did not recognize it. They assumed it was something he had collected during his career in government, some kind of historical artifact or curiosity. They donated it along with his other papers to an archive at the university where Jennifer taught. The medal sits there now, in a box with other miscellaneous items, uncatalogued and unexplained. The engraving is still clear. The name Sparrow is still visible. But no one knows what it means or who it belonged to, or why a retired CIA analyst kept it locked in his desk for 26 years. The Cold War was fought in small spaces, in homes and offices and the ordinary places where people live. It was fought by people who seemed ordinary but were not. It was fought without acknowledgement, because acknowledgement would have destroyed the illusion that allowed it to continue. Thomas spent 18 years hunting a spy, and 16 years married to that spy, and another 26 years living with the knowledge that he had chosen family over duty and survival over honor. There is no moral to this story, because morality requires clear choices, and Thomas never had clear choices. He had only impossible ones. He chose what he could live with. Whether he chose correctly is not a question anyone can answer. Not then, not now, not ever. If stories like this make you rethink how close the world came to losing itself in the silence between husbands and wives, in the secrets kept in locked drawers, in the medals that mean everything and nothing, consider subscribing. These are not just stories. They are warnings about what happens when the people we trust are trained never to be trusted. When the lives we build are performances we never audition for. When love and loyalty become operational, covers for something we can never name. This is what the Cold War was. Not armies, not missiles, just people in houses pretending everything was fine while the world ended quietly around them, one dinner at a time.